Okay, this is a big week for contract law. I can see that my video is quite slow. Is it problematic at your end?
It's a bit stuttery, but
Yeah.
I mean, we can still see you. So
Oh my!
We can hear you fine.
the audio is fine. Yeah.
As long as you can hear me, everything's good. So what I thought I would do today, subject of course to any questions, concerns, frustrations, discussions you want to have, is I thought we might just go straight into doing a bit of a quiz together, and just sort of talking through some of the aspects of what we went through in class yesterday. And by the looks of things, sorry, I can't see you, and you're the one right now that I'm having trouble putting a face to the name of. But I think I can't remember. In other words, I can't remember whether you were there or not yesterday, Zoe. But I think everybody else was. Is it a fair thing to just have a bit of a reinforcement on intention and certainty?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, sure.
Cool. Oh, your voice sounds familiar there, Zoe, so all good. Well, what I'm going to do is just find it, of course, and share my screen with you. Let me just do that. Sorry. So I think I can just... Okay, let's go here. Sorry, I should have had this set up ready to go, shouldn't I? And then I need to share my screen. Yeah, maybe don't share the marking that I'm doing right now. In fact, what I want to do is clear previous results. Excellent. And I want to... okay, you actually need the question, don't you? That would make it so much easier. Let's start. I've just realised, because now, oh, goodness me, Catherine, you are a joke sometimes. A joke! Let me just share a question with you. I just need to pull it up properly here. Okay, sorry, let me put it on something where you can see it. Catherine. Sorry, it might be a second, just my computer's deciding to be really annoying. What is going on here? Okay, sorry, that's just not going to work. It's just not working. Just 2 seconds. Back into fundamentals of contract law. That is the subject that we are in. Teaching PowerPoints. Sarah. Don't be silly. All right, let's not do that one first. Let's go instead to another one I prepared earlier. Instead of the problem one, a direct one, we will look at certainty first. Okay, I need clear results, and I need full screen. There we go. So, again, you will need a phone or some other commitment. You clearly can have multiple screens on at a guess. What we are looking at here is, sorry, I'm assuming you can see the question. It says I'm sharing, yes. I am going to not show results to start off with, even though some of them have already gone through. So which of the following requirements must be fulfilled in order for a contract to be enforceable? You can select more than one if you wish. To do that in this particular circumstance, you actually have to answer the question a couple of times from memory. So it might only let you do it once or twice. We've got a few answers in there. There are almost as many answers as there are people. Let us have a look. So for a contract, oh, sorry, let's not do that. Let's do that. So contract needs to be complete. Contract needs to be certain. Sufficiency. So sufficiency is disappearing now as people are changing their mind in relation to it. Let's just talk a little bit about that word sufficiency. I love seeing this change as people fix their answers. Wouldn't you like to be able to do this in an exam? And then just see what everybody else was saying, like even if you didn't get the correct answer. Basically, both of these, completeness and certain, are correct. Sufficiency is a word that we use in relation to consideration. And in order to have a binding contract, we need to have sufficient consideration. So in other words, there needs to be an exchange of things that the law considers to be sufficient. The maxim is that consideration needs to be sufficient, but that doesn't mean that it needs to be adequate. So again, this, it feels a bit tricky to throw those words together, but when we're talking about this kind of language, the contract must be sufficient. That's actually a relatively meaningless sentence. I know why people have ticked the box there, and because you're smart people and you're thinking, actually, the consideration needs to be sufficient. We need sufficient consideration in order to have an enforceable contract, but you've actually not thought through what the wording meant in relation to that one. Oh, this is not helpful if you can actually see the results first. Okay, might need to go and see if I can hide all of these in some way. I've been thrown, but okay, let's not look at what each of you are saying. If the agreement between parties has omitted a term, the omission may be fatal to the formation of a binding contract. I need to move my screen here so I can even read the top of my screen, which is ridiculous. Thank you. If, again, there might be more than one correct answer here. One party has fully performed their obligations. The term isn't important. The parties discussed the issue but did not reach, that should read but did not reach agreement, or the parties have both signed the contract but not yet performed. By the way, because we're not doing this, under any time conditions, happy to have a discussion about the options if you want to as we go. Throw your questions into the mix. Everybody's quiet. A few people have put things in. Let's have a look at what you're saying. Okay, so we're all in overwhelming agreement that if the term is not important, omitting it is not going to be fatal. And that is absolutely correct. We're also, it appears, in a very strong agreement that if the parties discussed the issue but didn't reach agreement, then omitting that term will be fatal. Somebody want to, you don't have to disclose that you gave that answer, but anybody want to share with me the thinking behind that? Other than you saw lots of people had their, had it before I started.
Yeah, Kath, I'm just thinking if it was an essential term, that it might be fatal if there was no agreement or that was omitted and not discussed. But I'm just trying to think if it wasn't an essential term, then my answer might be different. I'm just trying to wrap my head around that concept.
Actually, I think that's really good logic. And if it is an essential term and the parties didn't reach agreement on it, then I think we definitely have an enforceability problem. I will absolutely agree with that. But if it's not an essential term, or it wasn't, so do you want to, what is an essential term in this context?
What is an essential term in this context?
Maybe it'd be something that both parties agree on. Like it's like an overlapping principal term that they both recognise?
The definition, and probably the place to look for the definition would be in Whitlock and Brew would help you with that. The case involving the land belonging to Shell. Effectively says that an essential, or tramways, actually tramways and Luna Park is probably a better example again. And the definition goes along the lines of a term that without agreement on its contents, the parties wouldn't have been able to continue with the agreement. So it tends to be things like who the parties are. It's essential to the enforceability of an agreement to know who it is you can enforce your agreement against. The subject matter of the agreement. So if I'm going to sell you a house and you've agreed to pay me $1 million for it, it's an essential term that I identify which house with sufficient clarity and purpose. You're not just going to, it's essential to your decision to give me $1 million that you're going to get the house you expected. Usually the price or the consideration or the basis for calculating it will be essential. Where non-essential terms might include things like how we're going to sort out our differences if we have a dispute at some time in the future. Or if I've got an ongoing access to something under this agreement, whether or not I can transfer that to somebody else or not. So this particular option doesn't talk about essential terms, but I would give it to you if it did talk about essential terms. I think that absolutely makes it, oh, sorry, wrong button. I want to do that instead. Show correct. Oh, interesting. I actually was not expecting the right answer to be that. All of you have agreed, clearly, but if it is essential.
Kath, can I ask? I didn't put that one as my correct answer, but if you didn't agree on a term, of course it's been omitted.
Yeah, and that's actually where I was going. I'm saying I'm like a little bit surprised that I've got that in there, and I was clearly thinking about something different when I put it together the first time around. If it's an essential term, I agree. So if the question had said, if the agreement between the parties has omitted an essential term, the omission may be fatal. Well, no. If the agreement between the parties has omitted a term, the omission may be fatal to the formation of a binding contract if the parties discussed an essential issue but didn't reach an agreement. I would say that answer is correct. And again, I clearly haven't reviewed what was happening in this one in preparation. I'm like naughty. But again, I'm with you, Ash, that there is plenty of cases where it's particularly relevant if the parties were negotiating about a point and they couldn't reach agreement, then a court will say the fact you couldn't reach agreement is evidence that this is not a term that should be implied into the contract, or that you reached agreement around everything else. So that term, you either considered it to be non-essential or, you know, otherwise you wouldn't have reached an agreement at all. The fatality, the formation of a binding contract. So what did you put in there, Ash? One that nobody's
one of the other two.
The other two, you're not telling.
I put my head in.
I'm going to criticise myself here. I think this is a really lame question.
Yeah, I got confused.
I don't actually answer it clearly. But what's the point of the point of the questions is so that we can have a discussion about them. So I've been having a week. It's clear to you all. What can I say? But at the end of the day, if one party has fully performed their obligations under the contract, we are significantly less likely to have a court find that there is no contract. And again, the maxim is it's better to find meaning somewhere than consider something void. I think that the sensible answer here, if we're talking about an essential term, if neither party has performed and there is an essential term that's been omitted, we're more likely to find a void contract. Okay, note to self, not only fix the typos, but fix what's going on. All right, I'm just going to stop sharing for a minute and start turning some of these things off because it's clearly behaving badly and making me look more idiotic than I normally do. And where are you? Oh, you've all disappeared from view. No, that's not going to be. Where are you? You've all disappeared. Please don't tell me that I've closed the meeting.
We're still here.
You're still here, good.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to find the pattern. No, don't make changes to my device. Okay, but you can't see my screen. I can't see you. Oh, I can see you now. All right, share. Oh, ridiculous. No, I don't want to leave the meeting. Can't see through my own thing. I don't want you to read my email. I don't mind if you read my email, but here we go. I am going to hear the results. Meredith and Derek. This shows how long ago it was that I made this question. Meredith and Derek entered into the contract for the sale of 2,000 surgical gowns. No, I don't want to do anything like that. Save the changes, fair enough. Price wasn't indicated on the contract. They were delivered by Meredith to Derek as specified in the contract. Derek has refused to pay to Meredith as he has decided he doesn't want the gowns anymore. Is the contract between Meredith and Derek binding? So, options include price is an essential term. As the price has been omitted, the contract can't be binding, effectively. Yes, price isn't an essential term, so the contract is binding. No, the contract remains wholly executory, therefore the contract is not binding. Or yes, statute imposes an obligation to pay a reasonable price if the price has not been indicated. So again, let's have a quick discussion about it. Oh, ridiculous woman that I am. Sorry, my computer is doing the most ridiculous things. I'm just going to save that. Goodness knows what that means for me. No, I don't want to close the meeting. It keeps asking me to quit out of the meeting. It's driving me insane today. So any thoughts, any comments? 5 answers in there. Let's have a look and see what you're thinking. Price is an essential term, so the price has been omitted. So we have it in a majority there, where an ever-shrinking minority sitting in the question of whether or not it matters that you've actually performed the contract. So I'd like to actually talk about this one. If that answer were correct, wouldn't we be in the situation that every contract that we enter into could evaporate, become void, up to the moment that somebody started performing it? Or am I being too dramatic there? Are you seeing that as the combination of the omission of the price?
What do you mean by that?
Well, I've agreed to sell you some surgical gowns. We haven't nominated the price on the contract. At the moment, neither of us have done anything. So you could say, we've got no price on there, the contract's void, neither of us has done anything, too bad, so sad, no agreement. But doesn't that leave us at risk that at any given moment in time, we could have contracts that we'd agreed everything, bar fine detail perhaps, and people could walk away. Sorry, what were you going to say, Steph? Sorry, I've got you down here, which is why I keep looking down.
Oh, it's okay. I was just wondering if maybe there's been consideration in the form of promises. So it's sort of like price to be paid later. To be, you know.
Well, it does say in the question here that the price wasn't indicated in the contract.
Yeah, maybe I was thinking like that could come later if, that would require a lot of trust, I suppose, that you would.
Yeah. Well, and that's a lack of certainty, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I'm interested that nobody came down here, because when we've got something where we've got goods that are not, presumably not that uncommon, something where you can get a market price, the Goods Act says you just have to pay a reasonable price. So if there was an essential term that wasn't price, so again, would a colour of surgical gowns be an essential term? I think not. Would them meeting a particular OH&S requirement for surgical gowns? Probably would. I would suspect, my experience with buying and selling surgical gowns is somewhat limited, but it seems to me that that's probably something that comes with an innate quality mechanism. And so if you were just going to sell any old rags that weren't actually suitable for purpose, or if you hadn't actually qualified what they were, but because we have the Goods Act, if we've got goods, or even without, it's really restating the common law anyway, even without the Goods Act, but the Goods Act is helping us here. If we are able to identify what the price is, then we still have a contract. If we can do a reasonable, some kind of reasonable decision-making process.
What if it was a service rather than a goods?
If you were able to work out what it was, like what the going rate was, if there was a market for that service, I think the answer is yes. The Goods Act deals with goods specifically, but as a matter of common law, if there is a reasonable market for working out what the price is, I think you're probably okay. It's when you have some sort of service or some sort of subject matter that is quite unique. So think about Whitlock and Brew, where the provision in the sale document said that the purchaser would sublease or would lease the property back to Shell at a rental and on terms that would usually be found, or I think the words were customarily found in agreements relating to that type of lease. But the court found, well, there's no evidence of any customary standard terms in relation to the lease back of land on which you store huge amounts of oil and petrol, that there are all sorts of unique features to that particular lease. But if we were talking about a lease of residential property, for example, so I'm buying a house from you and there's a term that says you will lease me back the house on usual terms of unusual rent, then we can work out that there is a Law Institute standard lease and a Real Estate Institute of Victoria standard lease. We could use either of those, and you could go to 3 real estate agents, or even these days online, and get sort of standard rent for a home with that number of bedrooms in that particular suburb. So again, it's going to depend a little bit on what the circumstances are.
If the contract had specified that there would be a price, but it wasn't agreed, I can see then how the consideration aspect comes into it. If there was no mention of any price whatsoever in there, doesn't the contract then lack the consideration element that makes it binding?
If there's no price at all,
if it doesn't mention, like if they said, I will pay you a price at a time later determined, I can see the consideration aspect in there. But if there was no mention of price at all, and there was no mention of I will pay you at a later date, then doesn't that contract then lack consideration?
Completely lacks consideration. So how might you do that? If you needed to do that, what could you do? I'm just going to make my home available to you rent-free for the rest of your natural life. I'm going to make that promise. I don't want anything from you.
You'd need a deed to do that then.
Perfect. Exactly. Because any contract that we entered into would lack consideration. Another way might be Steph's favourite case, which we stumped you with it last week, Thompson & Thompson. Another way might be that we agree that you're going to pay me $1 or £1 a year.
Yeah.
And that would be fine. Or that you're going to front up with peppercorn. So there we're talking about the consideration piece. But if we've got a document, and this is quite common with standard forms, particularly in relation to the sale of goods, I've got my standard form sale of surgical gowns, terms and conditions. I give it to you. You fill in the gap, how many you want, what day you need them delivered by. I might even have a price list somewhere, and the prices might vary depending on what number of surgical gowns you apply to purchase from me. It's most likely my form and my advertising material about how much my surgical gowns are is an invitation to treat. You fill in the form and sign it. You're applying for it, but you leave the price blank. I might forget to fill that in. Again, the Goods Act comes to my rescue there. But then the other thing that we could, and we'll talk about this in relation to formalities this week, is a contract doesn't necessarily need to be in one document. So your offer to purchase my gowns, we can assume is made based on my advertising material, unless we negotiate a different price. So again, in the scenario I just gave you, wouldn't be fatal that you didn't put the price in there, because it's easily ascertained by reference to those materials.
Yeah, I was just thinking back to the Manchester City Council and that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's the same principle then, yeah, makes sense.
Well, the principle there is slightly different, because in that one, he didn't actually put the price in. He was making an application, but he was making an application. At best, he was making an offer. Yeah. And could be rejected at that stage. Okay, we're going to do this again. I'm completely messing it around. I can see. Take that down to full screen. Clear results. And now I am going back to the screen again. Nothing like making it complicated. Man, Butcher and the King. Oh, we didn't talk about this one the other day. Where parties have deliberately deferred agreement on price. Oh, yes, say that, sorry. The court can still impose an obligation to pay a reasonable price. Parties have deliberately deferred agreement on price. So it's slightly different from the scenario we've just been talking about. Anybody want to talk through their reasoning or their thinking? My sneaky glass of wine is almost empty. Given how many little things have been going wrong, that is really bad to have on the recording that I was having a glass of wine. I really am hoping I'm amongst friends.
I decided to go with true, just
Tell me
on the conversation that we just had about the reasonable price, and it also the reasonable price sort of serves to make transactions like the effect on a wider scale would be to sort of enforce transactions and to, make it more efficient, I suppose. But I guess you did stress before that the parties might have deliberately deferred, and maybe the courts need to respect that there's been that action.
So these words are really important. We've deliberately deferred agreement. So in fact, you cannot have an agreement to agree. So that is different from the scenario that we've had. Steph, I really like your reasoning, and I think your reasoning applies in relation to the kind of scenario that we've just been talking about. But in relation to if we deliberately defer, what we're saying is we're not reaching agreement now. We have to reach that agreement later on. The court will not enforce an agreement to agree. And so that's different from actually omitting the price or not gathering all of the documents you need in one place to get the price, or having a formula for determining what the price might be in the future. By saying, we're not going to agree that now, we'll agree it later, we actually have a failure of consideration, and leads itself to an incompleteness. And I think this is one of the key points that I want to get across with these later two formation element topics, certainty and intention, is that they're necessarily bound up into the ideas of offer and consideration, and that they fit together. We've sort of taken these individual jigsaw pieces and examined them really carefully, but ultimately we need the whole of the jigsaw to make sense of an agreement. Okay, so that was a little bit of a tricky one, but again, you need to read the detail of the agreement to get there. Okay, let's see if I can do this next one again. Let's do that. Clear. Full screen, back again. Oh, I can see that there's chat going on that I'm ignoring. Good. Oh, I can move that down there. That's excellent. Okay, and then we'll go back up here again. Clear results. Oh, you guys are at, can you see that one already? Because of course you're in on your own thing. I forget that I don't really need to share the screen. Whoa. Sorry, I just cleared somebody's results. Sorry about that. Uncertainty is more likely to affect a contract that is illusory, wholly executory, partly performed, or wholly performed. As is usually the case, more than one answer might apply, but the way that this is set up, you kind of have to pick the answer that you like the best. Let's have a look, a few of you in there. I find it interesting that people change their minds or adjust things when they can see what other people have said or done. It's one of the reasons I actually like doing these quizzes is it requires you to make a call, because we all sit there and we get confirmation bias. So what's an illusory promise?
One that's sort of on the discretion of the promisor.
Yeah.
Sort of.
So basically it's something that looks like a promise, but at the end of the day, the promisor is not really committing to anything. So it's actually quite related to this idea of a lack of consideration. So a few of you are looking at the part saying that uncertainty is more likely to affect a contract that is partly performed. Anybody want to share their thinking around that?
I think if something's partly performed, then there's more likely to be a dispute.
Okay, yeah, I see your logic. So then the question becomes, is there a contract I had to perform in the first place?
Yeah.
So it's creating that, oh, somebody is now added in wholly performed. I love to see things move.
Sorry, that was me. I dropped my phone.
Oh.
I thought it was sorry. I think I do.
I agree with Ash. You make a really, really excellent point there. Sorry, in my screen you're over there, which is why I keep looking in the wrong direction. I think you make a really good point that unless and until people actually do something, spend some money, participate in something, we're less likely to have a dispute. Although if you are at that point where you feel like you've entered into a contract, you're ready for something to happen, and then nothing happens, it's a similar issue. The reality is the courts will find it very difficult to call a contract void if a party has performed their obligations. So even if the contract is void or if there is uncertainty, they will find, again, the maxim is, the ut veris maxim is that it is better to find something meaningful than it is where it looks like a contract than it is to just let it slide. And there would be an unfairness if one party had done all of the things that they promised and the other party could claim that they don't have to do anything because there was never a contract in the first place. So again, uncertainty, why do we need to know about uncertainty? Because we need to know, as drafters of contracts, how difficult the situation will be for our clients if the documents that we draft lack certainty, and that if we have provisions that are so uncertain as to mean that they are ultimately void, that they need to be excised out of the agreement, then we may as well not have an agreement at all. The point of a documented contract is to help our client be as certain as they possibly can be about what the outcomes of their transaction are going to be. Now, this doesn't mean that we have to document absolutely everything perfectly. Far from it. There's no expectation that every combination and permutation will be addressed in a contract. But if something is of sufficient importance to a client, to a contracting party, and here I'm really thinking about our clients, then we really need to make sure that they're clearly dealt with in the contract. And we don't want to be in a situation where we're then going and relying on a court to find that there would be an estoppel, or find that that they're going to need to imply a term into a contract to make it make sense. How are we doing? Oh goodness, we've been spending quite a lot of time on this one and I haven't fixed the other one up yet. Have a look and see what the other one is. Yes, we can save the changes here. Oh, actually, let's go show results, clear results. Stop share for a second. Next. Show results. And of course you can see it anyway, so I'm not quite sure why I'm fussing around it. But call and bust, another one we didn't really speak about in any detail yesterday. Call and bust. High Court held that the clause with respect to depreciation was uncertain. I'm going to remember the case now. Let's just have a look. Sorry, I'm trying to remember what. Sorry, I'm cheating. I'm looking at what's correct before we even start, because you haven't read the case and I'm not going to remember it off the top of my hand.
We're not seeing this come up.
Oh, you're not seeing this one come up? Okay, I might even skip this one because it's a detail point that I don't think you actually really need to know. Let me just clear this. I will bring. Now, I'm going to go back onto uncertainty. What do I want to tell you about uncertainty that's coming out of these? There's a couple of these quiz questions at the end. the ones that are in my quiz here are very dependent on some of the clauses in the cases, which is not going to come up in relation to your exam at all. What's the value in looking at cases like Coldcliff Collieries or Whitlock and Brew, Hall and Bust? Some of the others are, I just mentioned Whitlock and Brew, Walford and Miles, or a couple of others of them that are around. There's a Hunter, Chilling and Freezing. Why there is value in having a good look at those cases when you get the time to do so is that the court will examine the clauses of the contract and you will see the judges unpick whether or not the clauses make sense, whether they are sufficiently certain, sufficiently complete or otherwise. And that will inform your understanding of the way that a judge is going to read a contract that you draft. But it will also inform your understanding of the kinds of issues that come before the courts in understanding this kind of issue. In relation to certainty itself, I think the important point is to understand that it's actually quite rare for a court to find that there is a lack of certainty, provided that promises are not illusory. If we have illusory promises on one side and we don't have a deed, then we actually see the agreements fall over for lack of consideration. If we have an agreement that is capable of being performed and an offending clause can either be excised out, so it can be severed from the contract as a whole, or the party who has the benefit of it can waive it, then the rest of the contract continues. And when we have a contract that's been performed at all by any party, then the courts are looking for a way to make a sensible reading of that contract. Does that make sense? So it becomes quite an academic point, the question around certainty, but at the same time we need to understand it. And I find the easiest way to understand it is to think about it going back to this idea of offer, that the offer contains the DNA of the deal, and the offer needs to have everything in it, contained within it or accessible to it. That means that the minute that it is accepted, a binding agreement is formed. So it's going to be another week before I can give you proper feedback in relation to the assignments that I've been marking. But something that I have been seeing happening that's going, that comes up over and over again is this idea that, or the potential for an idea that until money is paid, there is no contract. And that is actually, that's not technically correct. Sometimes consideration will be the payment of money, but usually consideration is an exchange of promises. Now, there might be only nanoseconds between the promises being made and performance of those promises, but usually the price of a promise is another promise. So there's a technical difference between a promise to pay money and the payment of money. The promise to pay money is the consideration. The payment of the money is the fulfillment of that promise. And because consideration moves both ways, for the promise that you make, you receive another promise back. So this is where certainty falls, where we see it create issues for agreements most often, is when the promises are illusory. So the price of a promise I make to you to transfer land to you is in exchange for your promise to pay me a reasonable price based on your discretion in the moment, however you feel about it, whether or not you'll give me the approval, blah, blah, blah. If that's a completely illusory promise, then there's no promise that you've exchanged, and it's actually a failure of consideration. I feel like I'm waving my hands around quite a lot, not necessarily actually speaking to you. So does that make sense? Okay, it's 7:15. Do you want to have a quick look at a couple of questions on intention? Thumbs up. Okay, give me a second to sort that out. In the meantime, throw questions at me or each other and see if I can multitask, because that's always amusing.
I did have a question about the Greek fella. I don't know how to pronounce the name of the Yes, and the Greek Orthodox community of SAE. I don't understand. I mean, I understand the case, but I don't understand why that seems to be applied in family law almost. Like in the textbook, it says agreements between family members, and then it talks about that case and then goes on about why that's applicable. But that's, I don't know, I don't seem to get the connection.
Good question. So the actual language that was used up until Hermogenes is family and social relationships. So the Greek Orthodox Church, or in fact it's a particular branch of the Greek Orthodox Church whose name I am not even going to try and say out loud, their argument was right from the very beginning, well, this is not in the nature of a standard business relationship. This is a spiritual relationship that is more akin to the kind of relationship that you have in a family. And so that's the reasoning. It's the basis. It's more like a family relationship than it is like a commercial relationship. So the presumption is that there is no consideration. Does that make sense? So, because it doesn't neatly fall into either, I agree with you. But the courts agreed that, yeah, it's not a traditional commercial relationship, but is that a particularly serious thing? Possibly not.
I'm not sure if that has a lot of application if you're talking about a partner or a husband and wife or whatever, though. That's the bit that I'm a little bit confused on.
Well, ultimately what came out of Hermogenes was this idea that, and I love the language that they use, that the courts or the law shouldn't be ossifying in any way. So let me find screen 2, that will be you. Share, hopefully you can see the whole of my screen now.
Yep.
Gorgeous. That will work much better. So what Hermogenes, I mean, the principle that comes out of Hermogenes is that regardless of the type of relationship that you have, it is a necessary element of having a binding contract under Australian common law that the parties intended it to be a contract that was enforceable by the courts. And at best, the nature of the relationship that the parties have with each other points to the onus of proving that it is or is not intended to be a binding relationship. So on the whole, if you have what looks like a standard commercial relationship, arm's length commercial relationship between two parties, and they enter into an agreement, there will be a presumption that the intention was that that is a binding, enforceable commercial agreement. And so if a party wants to argue that there was no intention for that agreement to be enforceable and therefore no contract, then it's the party who wants to demonstrate that there's no contract who has the onus of proving that. If your relationship is a family relationship or a social relationship or a domestic relationship, then there will be a presumption that agreements that you enter into are not meant to be enforced by courts, that they will be of a domestic, social, family type arrangement, agreements between friends. But if one of you, but that doesn't preclude domestic people in a domestic relationship from entering into a contract with each other. But if there is a dispute as to whether or not the parties intended that it be an enforceable arrangement, then the onus is on the party who wishes to demonstrate that the intention was that the parties be bound and that the relationship can be enforced by court, or the contract can be enforced by a court. That felt very long-winded. I hope it was helpful.
No, it was. Thank you.
So let's have a look at this little problem. Sarah, trained nurse. She works and lives in London. She loves her job. She loves living in London. She owns her own flat there. She gets an email from her parents who plead with her to return to Melbourne. They're both very ill and they want her to come home and act as their carer. They promise her they'll leave their home in Brighton to her in their respective wills in gratitude for her services and for what she's giving up. Sarah sells her flat, she resigns from her job and she heads home to Melbourne. She acts as a carer for her parents for 6 years. They die, and at that point she finds out that she is not in the will. They've left everything to the cat's home. So, was there a contract that her parents and Sarah had? This is clearly going to be part of the question. Is there a contract that might be in place? So let's start with this. I'll keep coming back to the question as we need it. In determining if Sarah entered into a legally binding relationship with her parents, the court will use all the evidence available to it, including an objective and a subjective approach. True, false, yes, no, what do we think? Yep, they're going to look at everything. Subjective, objective, what they really intended, what they told people they intended. Oh, we've got a majority saying they will look at everything. I'm with the minority though. Doesn't actually matter what Sarah's parents actually intended. What matters is what Sarah intended for that matter. What actually matters is what a reasonable person having the information available to both of them, looking at the correspondence that they exchanged, looking at the facts of the situation would think. So we continue to use this objective test. Questions, concerns, frustrations? Move on to the next one.
Sorry, Kath.
Yeah?
How did that differ from, because the facts were very similar with Wakeling and Ripley. How did that differ? Was that the same sort of rule that we established from that case?
So I would actually, in fact, the next case, I won't give the answer. I think the case is actually much more analogous to a different case from Wakeling. Ultimately, when we're looking at what parties intended, throughout all of contract law, we are going to use an objective test.
Okay.
So in Wakeling and Ripley, they still were not using a subjective test. So if they had information that had been shared, they're still using an objective test. What would the parties have understood each of the other parties to have meant by the things that they said and did? So we always use an objective test.
Yeah, makes sense.
So in fact, I don't even have Wakeling and Ripley on this slide because this case actually reminds me very much of one of the other cases. Anybody want to hazard a guess as to which one it is?
I'm going to guess Merit and Merit, but Balfour and Balfour, there's some similarities between the two, I guess. Right, from what
I'm with the one person who's gone with Todd and Nickel, actually. In Todd and Nickel, we had people in Glasgow. They had a job, they had a house, they sold up and moved their whole lives across the country because they came to look after somebody who was ill in exchange for the promise that was made. And, you know, probably some love and affection at that time. Some of the differences, how were they different? We're talking about Sarah and her parents, so a closer relationship. In Todd and Nickel, my memory is that the aunt that the woman and her mother came to look after was actually the aunt of her then deceased husband, so there wasn't as close a relationship. But other than that, we've got quite similar facts. It's probably not helping that because of the way that we did it in class, we weren't looking so closely at the facts. But at the end of the day, all of these, Balfour and Merritt are both husband and wife cases too.
Mm.
Right, so again, distinguishing on the facts can be helpful. Sometimes it's not helpful at all. It depends on what principles we're looking at. But often when we're looking at a principle, then we've got to think, well, have we got analogous facts? How could we distinguish? What's the same? What's different? Not a lot turns on it, other than to actually point out that in both exams and assignments, unfortunately very rarely in real life, in exams and assignments, often questions are crafted out of using the facts from cases, changing the names and the places and things like that. So it's a good idea sometimes to work, to be able to pick up the fact overlap. Oh. So more than one might apply here. What factors would a court take into account in determining if a legal relationship exists between Sarah and her parents? The kind of relationship they had, subject matter of the agreement itself, the status of the parties, so many typos, the intentions of the parties, and whether money had changed hands. A little bit frustrating because you can only probably hit one or two, and there are definitely more that apply here. Intentions, actually, I've marked that as, well, I haven't included that as correct, but I'm actually happy to give that as correct in the sense that an objective review of the intentions of the parties, an objective understanding would be, usually if we're just using what the parties intended in a sentence, our understanding of that would be subjective. So what I really meant by that was blah, 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 or what she meant, what she didn't mean, etc. But based on our immediate discussion just about the objective intention, I'm actually happy with the answer, intentions of the parties in that context. So the first three, though, there come directly from Ermogenes. So in Ermogenes, the High Court said, well, these are the kinds of things that we're going to look at. And really, these three things come down to working out what is the objective basis for understanding what the parties actually intended. Happy enough with that one? Especially when I'm saying something that said it's wrong is right. Let's move on to the next one. If an agreement was entered into between Sarah and her parents, if it was a commercial agreement, so let's just assume it is for the purpose of this question, which of the following statements would be correct? There is no presumption that the agreement is intended to be binding. There is a strong presumption that the parties intended the agreement to be legally binding. The onus is on Sarah's parents to show that the agreement is not legally binding. The onus is on Sarah to show that the agreement is not legally binding. This is a weird question, actually. I'm not sure. I'm not sure I'm going to be happy with the answer it shows you in a minute.
So when you say the onus is on Sarah's parents to show the agreement is not legally binding, you mean they're executors given they're dead?
Yeah. Yeah. And that is, in fact, sorry, and that's very imprecise shorthand, but that's effectively, if there was a dispute, in fact, let's call them, what will we give her as a surname? Sarah Smith. Sarah Nichols, actually. Let's make her Sarah Nichols because, Todd and Nichols. and so it would be, the case would probably be nickel and nickel, but if she's bringing the action to sue them, then it would be the estate. So a good example of that is, in fact, Ash, you joined the class by the time we were talking about Ashton and Pratt.
Yes.
So in fact, that case was a case where Madeline Ashton brought an action against the estate of the late Richard Pratt. But it was, in fact, Pratt as the party name.
Yeah.
Good question or observation. Oh, a little bit of fussing around there. This one comes straight from the Thompson materials. What this falls on is if it's a commercial agreement. So either of these are ultimately true, because if it's a commercial agreement, then if there is a party who wants to demonstrate that it's not a commercial agreement, the onus is on them. This is what I was saying. As I was looking, I'm thinking, yeah, I don't like this question. I shouldn't have just typed this in the way that it came in. And I remember thinking this last time that I went through it, because I think what we're really saying here is, I think this is the section that is most relevant. The onus is on Sarah's parents. But the reality is, if Sarah didn't want it to be, if whichever party wants to demonstrate that it's not an agreement, the onus is on them. And if we have something that is a commercial agreement, and this is not a commercial agreement, so it's a confusing question. And the reality is, when I write the questions for the exam, I don't write them in that kind of ridiculous way. But I will, when we're doing our exam for this subject, we will have a headline problem with a number of sub-questions that come out of it. But I can promise you right now that they won't flip the facts in this way. I mean, it's, yeah.
So the second one's not incorrect. It's kind of like a matter of fact then. Like, of course, it's meant to be legally binding if it's a commercial agreement.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It is. There is, in fact, I wouldn't, the thing is, it's this, the thing that's probably very strong.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, yes, there is a presumption. It is not a presumption at the level of innocent until proven guilty. It's a starting point and not much more than that. And when you read Homogeneous, it actually points to, really all it's doing is demonstrating who has the onus of proof of demonstrating that there was intention. And in a commercial arrangement, it's the person who wants to demonstrate there is no intention. In a family relationship, it's the other party. One more, and then I think it might be time for us to finish up. Oh no, I've got a couple more. Unless you guys are absolutely racing to go. I feel like I'm being a bit slow today. Agreement between Sarah and her parents is an agreement made between family members, so it cannot be legally binding. Yes, yes, no, no. Yes, there's a presumption that it's not legally binding. Yes, only commercial transactions can be legally binding. No, there's a presumption that such an agreement is intended to be legally binding. No, the courts will determine if there is an intention to create legal relations based on the facts of each case. This one, I know I will agree with the answer, because this is a question that I wrote myself. Most likely in response to that last question that I didn't like, and I clearly didn't delete last time round. You're getting a view into the inner workings of how Kath prepares her classes. Okay, I've got a few answers in there. Let's have a look at the results. Okay, we're divided between two. 75% of you are in the same place. The agreement between Sarah and her parents is between family members, so it cannot be legally binding. Particularly since Homogeneous, but even in the lead up before that, that couldn't be correct. There is a presumption that it is not legally binding, which since Homogeneous goes to the burden of proof. I mean, really, most of you are on this 80% one here. or 80% of you are there. Ultimately, with all of these with intention, we're going to look at the facts in each case. We're going to objectively ascertain, was their intention? 9 times out of 10, actually 99 times out of 100, it's not even going to be an issue. But the question goes to who it is that needs to prove it. In family relationships, somebody is going to need to demonstrate, or social relationships, somebody is going to need to demonstrate the point. Somebody is determined to upset me by putting that top one in there. That's all right. I'm just going to move on. Questions, concerns, frustrations? Okay. On what basis might the court find there was an intention? More than one might apply in this particular case. What, in other words, what facts that you were given up front, I can split the screen again so you can have a look at it if you like, do you think a court is going to find most relevant? So we're agreeing love and affection is of little value in these cold courts. Not a great deal of interest there. Moving home, I don't really have a problem with that being in there. I think it's in Todd and Nickel, the giving up of the job, selling the flat, and it being a permanent arrangement were the things that were of most relevant. Actually, moving home in the context that she did, I think falls into that permanent arrangement thing. I think we're all on the same page here. I am very happy with that one, unless any of you have questions. What? You're just upsetting me now. I can say, well, let me move on. Okay. If Sarah's parents asked her to come home to care for them for only a month, do you think the court would have had a different determination? She still had to come home. She was still promised the house. She only agreed to come back because she was promised the house. Or Sarah wouldn't have needed to give up her property rights or her job. Again, we can talk these through as you go if you wish. Got a few answers in there. Let's see what people are thinking. We are in 100% agreement. Ultimately, it was those things that we talked about on the last slide that made the difference to the court's determination. Having said that, we don't remember that consideration just needs to be sufficient. It doesn't need to be adequate. And so giving up her property rights and her job indicated an intention. But if we had documented intention, in fact, the consideration might have just been coming for a month. If that's in fact what the parties agreed, you come back for this last month. That's all we do. But from the point of view of looking at intention, we need something more than just the consideration point. Let me go back in here. Next. What is next? Can Sarah prove that there was an intention in the agreement with her parents? No, she can't. The presumption is that there's no legally binding relationship. Yes, based on the facts of the case and the degree of reliance of Sarah on the agreement. Yes, she can. It was a commercial agreement. No, it was an agreement based on on trust, not a legal obligation at all. Some of you are much nicer to your parents than my children will ever be. I can see that. An agreement based on trust, not a legal obligation. I don't think I agree with that answer. Some of you put it in as an answer. I actually think the majority answer here is correct. Yes, based on the facts of the case. I'm trying to work out why that answer is sitting in there. Yeah, sorry, I'm looking for an agreement in myself. On the facts of the case, she has acted in reliance on the promises that were made to her, that she has demonstrated that her intention to be bound and her understanding that her parents intended to be bound by the promises they made by doing things like giving up a job that she loved, selling an apartment that she was happy with, leaving a place that she was happy living with. It may well be that in different circumstances, say the 1 month arrangement, that, and maybe that's what I was thinking when I wrote the question the first time around. But I'm with the majority here. Anybody else want to disagree with me? Because 20% of you agreed with the answer that's got a tick box on it, so it must be frustrating for you when I disagree with what my ticks say. You're all being quiet. You're very kind to me. The last question. Next time I talk to my parents, I'm going to ask them about their wills. In other words, I've clearly given up at that point. Any questions, concerns, frustrations? I have frustrations today. I clearly need to go through and check these quizzes significantly more carefully before I just roll them out on a Sunday night. So I'm going to apologise for that. We go to class tomorrow. But between now and then, any of you got questions you'd like to address? Well, on that note, I'm going to love and leave you then. You know where to find me if you do have questions. And again, my apologies for things not running as smoothly as they should have tonight. It's been a big week for us all. I think the Easter break can't come soon enough for most of us, I'm sure. Have a good week, people, and I will see, actually, I think everybody in this group tonight is face-to-face. I will see you in class tomorrow night, I hope.
Thanks, Kath.
Thanks, Kath. Cheers.
See you later, guys.
Yeah.
So, yeah.